Good morning, everyone. My name is LaDonna Redmond, and welcome to this morning's webinar, Moving Ahead on Food plus Justice equals Democracy. This webinar is offered by the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy to follow up on the work conducted at this September's Food plus Justice equals Democracy conference. We will be addressing questions from the audience today after the three panelists have finished their presentations. And you can submit your questions to us at any time during the webinar by using the question panel on your screen. Just type in your question and hit send, and we will review the questions as they come in, and the panelists will respond to them as quickly as they can, and we will get to as many questions as time allows after the presentations are finished. I just wanted to offer a couple of brief comments today. The Food plus Justice equals Democracy conference was a beginning to bring together the voices of the movement to look at how we could unite our various causes and concerns under a big enough umbrella, if you will, to move ahead on food justice. I don't know how many of you have looked today at the Huffington Post. One of today's articles talks about how President Obama needs us to help him move forward. And they identified a couple of other movements that have organized themselves in a way that makes that forward movement possible. They identified the gay and lesbian and transgender movement, which organized itself to get rid of the don't ask, don't tell mandate. They also talked about the Latino community coming together and insisting that President Obama have a moratorium on the deportation of Latino citizens or Latino immigrants. So there is a way to get the president to hear our concerns, and what we have to do is organize ourselves. So the Food plus Justice equals Democracy is just one opportunity to help bring together and unite our movement. But of course, we have a very interesting way of doing that. And the way that we looked at the conference was to divide the conference into a couple of components. One is to really look through the lens of historical trauma and its impact on communities of color as the basis of the narratives to understand how the food system has impacted communities of color. So that's one. The second piece was to eliminate the use of workshops, because we all have lived experiences, and to have folks come together around a concept called the People's Movement Assembly. Many of you all may have participated in People Movement Assemblies as a part of the social forums that were organized here in the United States. And we used the very similar concept to bring people together to look at large themes within the food justice movement and to try to identify principles that we could agree to work on together, or at least begin to have a framework for how we could work together. The third piece of that is to understand that those principles that came out of the conference, which I will share with you momentarily, they are available on our website. I'm going to show them to you right now, actually. Sam Simmons, if you're on next. And we're going to begin by just talking about the framework of historical trauma and why that framework was important in our approach to Food plus Justice equals Democracy. So I'll give you Sam Simmons.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sam Simmons, and I am glad to be part of this webinar. And as you see on the screen, we're going to start with why is historical trauma important? Well, when we're talking about historical trauma here, is that we're talking about a trauma that affects a large amount of folks, a massive group, and look over and how it crosses different generations. And so in talking about this, we're talking about how over time, how has this trauma affected generation after generation, and what does it look like now, and how might it get in the way of the work we're trying to do when we're talking about food justice? So we start with the example of the Native American community. We got these 6 areas of trauma in terms of the history. Their first contact with the white community and the economics, and as you can see on your screen here, and I'll go through all of these briefly a minute here. So the first contact, we're talking about, you know, what does that colonialism do in terms of the first contact? We're talking about a life shock. We're talking about the natives' diet before the first contact was corn, beans, and squash. Very rounded, more vegetarian kind of meals and food, including protein like from the bison. So now we got the whole beginning of the genocide with the disease, with the first contact, and the killing of the bison, you know, which was a lot of their traditions were tied around, and no time to grieve that because it never stopped. And then we got the economic competition, you know, strong beliefs about not wasting food. Now, so you have all this, these bison killed unnecessarily. What kind of effect did that have on the people in terms of their survival? And then we have the war period where we're talking about extermination of people and using food at that time to try to do that. And so again, we're talking about a people not having time to heal from ongoing trauma. And if we continue with this, we got the next eras in terms of assimilation, lack of food security again, boarding houses destroying the family system, and forcing relocation and what they call the termination period. As you can see, the different dates, 1945 to 1968. You know, so we're talking about now we're being natives are being not only put on reservations, but we're talking about the urban areas and the being prohibited from doing their religious freedom, and the start of increased use of processed foods. And again, that food insecurity, not having enough. So now we go to the African American community. We see the 5 areas that we look at in terms of this historical trauma. And so we start with chattel slavery. And we're talking about dealing with the people and treating them like a commodity. At the time, most of the slaves were, they raised cattle, they were fishermen, they were farmers, and they brought with them black-eyed peas, okra, and so we're talking about a lot of vegetables and those kind of things, and over time learned how to create a meal from throwaway foods. At the conference, one of the things I mentioned is how has my personal trauma over time has affected my way of looking at food. Like, for example, we African Americans brought watermelons with them, but because of the stereotype around watermelon, I don't eat them. And which is I found very interesting in myself, that I can be conditioned not to eat a fruit or that is brought here by my ancestors and feel ashamed to eat it. Then we have the Jim Crow area. Again, we're talking about not having time to heal from this trauma put upon a group of people, not an individual, and how that gets passed down. So we got Jim Crow area down south. We're talking about state-sanctioned terrorism, lynching. And the interesting part about lynching, there wasn't a lot of lynching during the slavery era because, again, we were worth something. We were a commodity. Sharecropping was after that. That was another way of a type of slavery to keep folks on the land and use that free labor. Then we got the migration to the north, and so we're talking about the industrial age. Now we left the farms, and some of us were, when we think about farming, we think about the whole issue of slavery. So a lot of us just left the farms and left the whole idea of the farm behind. And then we end up talking about being relegated to only certain sections of areas in the north, so we got the start of the black ghetto. And then we got through 1968 into the present. In some ways, no men in the house. We're talking about the whole thing about welfare, the rules around that. And so we're talking about the effect on families and that already been under attack in terms of black families, that foundation. And again, the whole thing, as you see with the Native Americans, the whole thing about processed food, processed cheese. And you know, this is one of the probably those bigger areas of looking at the whole issue around diabetes and that kind of thing. And this is also when soul food became a major term during this era. Then we have the drug war, the hyper ghetto, and so we're talking about crack cocaine and how that has an effect. And also, this is also interesting enough, this is also the time when a lot of the manufacturing jobs started disappearing. We're talking about having a large group of individuals, especially men who have third-grade educations, making $25 an hour, and now all of a sudden those jobs are gone, and so crack comes in, and the next thing you know that we have an epidemic that affects our children, affects the women in our community, and we still haven't, and the urban areas still haven't recovered from that. And so we have no connection with the land. We have a great big connection with fast food. We don't have healthy fruits and vegetables in the stores. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we're talking about why is this important? We're talking about people responding to high levels of stress, fight or flight, no time to recover. So now, what causes a person not to recover from a trauma? Well, they don't want to feel out of control, priorities, ongoing threats. So we can talk about ongoing trauma that continues, so you don't have time to recover, and new situations or denial of the event by others. So get over it, you know, that was in the past, those kind of things. So what does that look like? Well, that means that folks have difficulty connecting dots. You know, they say, you know, in terms of talking about all soul food is bad for you, or they tell us how to eat, or that kind of thing, when that all or nothing kind of response, or those kind of things, and conscious and unconscious expectations of being treated unfairly due to one's race or one's sexual orientation. So we're always aware, even when it's not even called for. So we got this hype, we're stuck in this fight or flight. And then we have the other side being frozen, conscious or unconscious, believing that things that people cannot change, so we don't even try anymore. And you see this in communities and individuals, we seem to identify it, but if you look at certain communities, we've seen these same things. Again, the inability to connect certain dots that are right in front of somebody. You know, there's more corner stores and less grocery stores in the community. You know, we can see it looking from the outside looking in, but a lot of times when you're in the middle of this, you don't always notice it. So what does that result in? It results in what we call survival stress management skills. In other words, acting or reacting without thinking of the consequences of the choices. So, or using things, even healthy things, as a way to get temporary relief, like food, like sex, you know. So, so if I'm using food as relief from the stress, then that means I might have a tendency to eat foods that are not always as good for me, that are what we sometimes call comfort foods. So I'm doing things that are not in my best interest and actually will increase the stress in my life. Also, this is also where we find that these communities have a tendency to lose their narrative of resiliency and resistance. And what do I mean by that? We talk a great deal of being a resilient people, but resilience is something that has to be passed down. Resilience is, in spite of what you've done to me, I can still make it. And when you lose that narrative of resilience, then you are stuck with this whole narrative of being victimized and survival stress narrative. So in conclusion, But we needed to develop a sensitivity to this historical and generational trauma and why it might, you know, how does it affect this whole effort of food justice, and how could it affect the collaboration? Understanding why people might not respond the way you think they should respond. It might be tied back into this generational historical trauma. And also, I believe in addressing this, we can also address some of the disparities in communities of color and just communities that have been continuously traumatized. Also, we need to take a look at this, and so we can address some of our own biases, our own prejudice, so we can eliminate the harm instead of asking questions of, well, why don't they want to eat healthy food, or why aren't they more concerned? That might be causing some harm. And so it also that we're all shaped by a story, and healing can start by embracing those stories. Because sometimes we don't want to deal with the ugly, but sometimes we need to deal with the ugly to be able to see the light. So instead of asking what's wrong, well, it's time to ask people what happened. So I hope, in this short period of time, I give a halfway decent overview. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I just want to call your attention, your attention to a couple of events that are going to be coming up in the next few weeks, and I want to do this early before I forget it. One is the Growing Food and Justice Initiative, Racial Healing Training in Chicago. That's going to be December 7th through the 9th at Growing Power's Iron Street Farm in Bridgeport. That's the neighborhood in Chicago, and you can get details about that at growingpower.org. I also want to mention that we're going to do some follow-up sessions regarding this particular topic on food and justice. And I want to direct your attention to IATP's website. And I am, for some reason, I guess, am I back on now? Can you hear me now? Great. Okay. I want to direct your attention to IATP's website to, one, learn more about the Food Plus Justice Equals Democracy principles that came out of the meeting in September. And I invite you to look at those principles and share them with your community. Sometime in January 18th, I will be in Chicago and will be hosting a meeting at the University of Illinois to talk more about those principles and how to operationalize them in various neighborhoods across the country. So with that, I am going to direct our attention to Sam Grant, who's traveling and has been gracious enough to speak with us while he is on his way to New York. So I'm hoping that you're in a stationary place where you can share with us, one, the reason that we use the People's Movement Assemblies in lieu of workshops, as well as how historical trauma, picking up the narrative theme of the conferences, was useful in conducting the PMA. So with that, I'll give you Sam Grant, who's the co-founder of the Center for Deep Democracy.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all can hear me all right. And I hope that you can see my PowerPoint up on the screen. It says Transcending Historical Trauma, the Historical Trauma PMA at the conference. And I got to move this out of my way because it is, There we go. So the reason that it made sense to use the People's Movement Assembly process instead of standard workshops is because if you want to heal from historical trauma, and part of LaDonna's vision was to make historical trauma front and center in the food justice movement, and the only way to do that was to use a convening process that brought in a high level of participation, and the process itself needs to be healing. So by using the PMAs, we created an open space so that all voices can be heard. We created an organizing process to support healing through which all perspectives were brought together in a common action plan in the 3 days of the PMAs that we did. So it made sense as a basic framework for the conference to get the whole movement into a necessary conversation and include everyone in a way that would move us towards some collaborative results. So the process, LaDonna and staff at IATP organized a PMA facilitation team, and then we facilitated the PMAs in the 6 different thematic areas during the 3-day conference. We designed a PMA process that worked for those 3 days. We defined the PMA process at the beginning of the conference and each day of the conference to everybody who was there. We made sure that our facilitators were ready to facilitate, because good facilitation is critical to PMAs or any kind of facilitation going well. We made sure we had note takers. In our case, people volunteered on the spot and did a really good job. So, just to encourage you to recognize that, the people who show up in the room usually have the capacities to help you make sure that these processes go well. After each one of our sessions, I took notes, generated 1 document from each of the small group discussions that happened in our PMA convenings, and then brought that back for the whole group with copies for each of the 3 days. The final day, we took all of our notes and recommendations and crafted 1 final set of about 17 recommendations, which you all can see. You got as part of your invitation to this webinar, but they're also all up on the IATP website. Ideally, going forward, there would be time for dialogue and pushback and incorporation of other ideas, and a clearer process for continuing to work on the PMA process between conferences. And everybody who came to the Historical Trauma PMA made a commitment to stay involved, but we haven't really been in regular discourse with each other. People saw the Google document, people had a chance to play a role in editing, but there really hasn't been a whole lot of energy. So one of my questions going forward is, what do we do to build momentum from the conference and really facilitate a high level of involvement? So real quickly, building on Sam Simmons' presentation, in order to heal from historical trauma, we need to reclaim history and culture and confront the trauma. We need to understand the trauma, release the pain of the trauma, and transcend the trauma. Coming out of our PMA, we looked at layers of healing action around healing historical trauma. 1 is organizing healing narratives through healing circles. 2, organizing local food sovereignty in a way that is culturally grounded, respectful, and equitable. Because there's ways to design food sovereignty that doesn't include all of the people. And so the food justice movement, in spite of its best intentions, can end up duplicating and reinforcing patterns of historical trauma. That's why it's critical that this frame be brought in. At the regional level, organizing culturally and environmentally sound regional food sovereignty to the full extent possible, to do that equitably, shift policies toward local food systems, nested in regional resilient systems with a global support system, and then at the national and the global level, obviously fighting for the policy mix that allows us to make sure that all people are all right. You all have all the recommendations, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading through them one by one. I'd encourage you to take some time with these recommendations and think about how you can make them live in your local community. So they're there on the screen. Look at them really quickly. There's like 3 slides of the recommendations, maybe 4, but I want to get to the last couple of slides here and sort of talk about some organizing maneuvers that we should consider collectively. So this is the last page of the recommendations here. But just look at this last one. Incorporate people's history projects in our movement networks and use our larger national and international convenings to connect our narratives together, just by virtue of recognizing that one of the fundamental things that needs to happen to heal from historical trauma is to have a community circle. And if we bring this circle process into our movement building work locally, and then we lift up those stories and we share them with each other regionally and nationally and internationally, that helps us develop a collaborative sense of what are the themes that matter and what are the kind of insights that are emerging from these healing circles about what to do going forward in terms of organizing it. So next steps I am seeing is that we need to convene the historical trauma PMA facilitators online and support capacity in all of the regions to do a continuation of historical trauma PMAs, historical trauma-driven organizing PMAs at all regional gatherings in the next couple of years, develop and refine a regional organizing framework, and then use those regional frameworks to craft national and international frameworks. So these are some steps I'm suggesting make sense. If you look at my diagram here, point 1 is the healing circles in each of our regions. Point 2 is emerging narratives as building blocks for vision and organizing. 3, connecting healing circles and visioning. 4, using visioning to shape new organizing approaches and networks. 5, heal our relations to food, land, and each other. And then 6, the fundamental, vision thesis that, a new us is necessary in order to generate a new, food system in the United States and around the world. And that's basically my conclusion. So, LaDonna, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Sam. I want to really underscore something that Sam said, and I want to be sure that we're all, understanding that historical trauma is an emerging framework, particularly in the area of public health. And so it really is up to us to kind of craft the particulars of this framework and to make sure that we're talking about the things that we want to talk about them in the way that we want to talk about them. So in the next couple of weeks, you all should be looking out for an announcement about a Facebook chat where we will spend some time discussing historical trauma as the framework. I plan on having another regional meeting sometime in the summer to really dig very deeply into this idea of historical trauma, and Sam Grant and Sam Simmons and I have all talked about this idea. We really want to build a cadre of activists that understand this framework and are able to use this framework as a part of our organizing strategy for a fair, just, and healthy food system. So you may see on your screen right now the draft principles of food justice. And again, I just encourage you to look them over and send feedback, think about them, share them with your groups and in your community. See what resonates with you, and let's see how we can move this agenda forward for a fair, just, and healthy food system. So our final speaker is Eric Holt-Gimenez, who many of you may know, who's the Executive Director of Food First. He doesn't need much introduction. Eric is a well-known speaker and advocate for a fair, just, and healthy food system. So with that, I will turn it over to Eric.
Well, thank you, LaDonna, and thank you to both Sams for your presentations, which I think really anchor the whole activity of People's Movement Assemblies at the conference that we had. I was in a different People's Movement Assembly, and I want to share what our process there. But basically, I think that these movement assemblies are extremely important and have turned out to be a very useful tool for the food justice movement, particularly coming out of the Minneapolis meeting, to build a unity of vision and common purpose. And not by evading the obstacles, by looking at the obstacles straight on. And I think that the historical trauma PMA really directed us to look at what's wrong and what's been wrong with the food system for so long, which is basically oppression. In other words, the food system isn't broken. It was founded on oppression. So it's not like we want to fix it, take it back to what it used to be. We need to do something new. And in order to do that, there's a lot of healing to take place. And we need that to happen before we can even talk about collaborating. In other words, we have to collaborate on that healing, and before we can begin to do things like construct common platforms for education, policy, and action. And that's got to, that type of healing and the dismantling of oppression and injustice has to be a part of all of those processes. So the PMA that I participated in was about local foods, community development, and public investment. And what we were really grappling with, we had a very big group and a very diverse group. And what we were grappling with was the fact that the food industry, or the corporate food regime, if you like, is an extractivist industry. It sucks dollars out of communities. And this is especially true in communities of color and underserved communities, both rural and urban, whose food dollars are basically sucked out of the community and then are not available for reinvestment and economic development. These are all communities that have been, behind every food desert is an economy which has been systematically devastated. So we can't talk about ending food deserts until we talk about ending that economic devastation and exploitation, and what role does the food system and the food movement play in doing that. So we started off by just saying that good, healthy food and community well-being are basic human rights. I think that everybody can agree on that, or at least no one is able to disagree with that. So it's a very powerful statement. But then we took an awful long time going from that to, well, what has to be done? And I think that what was very instructive for me was that there were a number of people in the room who had, 10, 20, 30 and more plus years of experience with food justice, and whose insights were invaluable. But there were a lot of people in the room who didn't have that experience, but had a lot of enthusiasm. And so it took quite a long time of discussion to sort of get back to some very basic principles, which I think if you had probably polled the more experienced people in the room from the very beginning, they would have laid on the table and they would have looked very much like I'm showing you right now today. But I think that that's what I learned was that's actually part of the work. Talking through that, some of the difficult parts of talking through that, and bringing people down, sort of drilling down deeper into what do we mean by food justice and community food security, and how do we get it. The process, the educational process, is extremely important. And of course, right away, one runs up against things like historical trauma, which you can't possibly address food justice without addressing that. And so it was a very, sometimes frustrating discussion. But I think that reflects very much reflects the work on the ground. And so it was, I think, very valuable to have it. And I was very happy that towards the end, people assumed leadership to direct the conversation in a very positive way towards these principles. One, basically, that food justice is the right of communities everywhere to produce, process, distribute, access, and eat good food, regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, citizenship, ability, religion, or community. And that community food security is the condition in which all people at all times have access to fresh, healthy, affordable, culturally appropriate food outside of emergency food situations. In other words, not relying on food banks and food pantries or food stamps, but in fact that people have a healthy food system which does provide for community food security. Now, all of this then is impossible without freedom from exploitation. And I think that for some people it's hard to understand that this food system was built on exploitation. And if we want freedom from exploitation, we're going to have to transform it into a very different type of food system than the one we have today. And there's also, it's extremely important to look at the rights of food workers to fair labor practices. And I think that behind this point is that the most food insecure people in the United States today are food workers. And that's true both in rural areas and in urban areas. It's true in the fields, it's true in the processing plants, and it's true in the restaurants, the organic, high-end, slow food restaurants, for example. That's also true. And so if we raise the rights of workers and the standards of workers within the food system, what that actually does is it makes those industries pay fair wages. That increases the income, and it levels the playing field so that local food justice initiatives, corner grocery stores, conversions, CSAs, etc., have a fair playing field, are not unfairly competed against by big industries like Walmart, who are exploiting their workers and can undercut their prices. We're also very important to have the local food system be values-based. In other words, not just based on the bottom line. Based on respect, empathy, pluralism, and valuing the knowledge of the different communities that are part of our local food systems. And in terms of addressing some of the racial trauma, the historical trauma, that food justice obviously is about racial justice. And not just the dismantling of racism, but also the dismantling of white privilege. And this was something that we didn't speak about at great length at the conference, but that did come up in this session, and it's something that Food First and other organizations involved with dismantling racism feel very strongly about. If we're going to dismantle racism in our food system, we're going to have to address the system of white privilege and what that means. And if the food system is going to be transformed at all, it of course has to be led by those who are most negatively affected by the food system. And those are underserved communities of color. So the white privilege, which always sort of bubbles to the top in so many of the food movement's organizations, has to be dismantled, and the leadership of underserved people from underserved communities has to be a priority in terms of our support. And then, of course, gender equity. The food system discriminates against women and girls around the world, but also in the United States. Within the food insecure communities, women and girls are the most food insecure. And so if we don't address the aspects of gender, it's going to be very hard to have community food security or food justice. And I think that this session overlapped very much with the session on food sovereignty, which is basically the right of people to find their own food, agriculture, livestock, and fishery systems. And while this concept comes from the global South, whereas food justice is very much a concept, if you take the roots back, you can take them back to the Black Panther Party. But this food sovereignty concept tends to come from peasant struggles in the global South. There's a tremendous amount of overlap in terms with the food justice movement, in terms of what they're getting at, which is environmental stewardship. Subsidiarity just means you do as many things as you can locally that you can, and that makes sense. You know, produce what you can produce locally, produce it locally. If you can't, well, then you have to get it from somewhere else. The same with jobs, the same with processing, the same with basically all economic activity. Try to keep that food dollar in the community, because that's where it can recycle 3, 4, and 5 times up and to provide economic development. And then recognize indigenous rights to land, territory, and resources, and people's rights to their sustainable livelihoods, and their right to not become involved in the market, capitalist market system if they choose to. In other words, they can consume and barter and donate and gift and whatnot. And then ownership of all aspects of the community food value chain. And I think that's where food sovereignty and food justice really have begun to converge, where we're beginning to realize we're not going to have community food security unless we have control over the food value chain at the local level, so that the value of the food system accrues to the people who are doing the work in that system and the people who are being most negatively affected by that system. We're not going to be able to pull out of food insecurity until we have control, economic control over the food system itself. And that, I think that's where food justice and food sovereignty really converge. And whichever term is appropriate for the food movement in the U.S., and particularly appropriate in order to counter the dominant food narrative of, sort of elitist, organic, very expensive food and whatnot that doesn't really address the issues which we're facing. I think that it's very important for us to address these issues of ownership and power as a way of transforming the food system. And just to end up, these principles I know were developed with the idea that we could affect national policy if we could come together around them. And there's models, as LaDonna mentioned earlier, for doing this and how this is done. And I think that that's exactly what we have to do. But I also want to say that I found these principles to be extremely useful at the local level to affect not just local policy, but to help bring together the local food justice organizations. We're incredibly fragmented. The model for social change, foundations giving money to local organizations who implement projects and whatnot, is breaking down. It's falling apart. It's worked for 30 years or so since the war on poverty, but it's completely breaking down. There's not enough money to go around. There's tons of organizations out there. And so now what do we do? We have to come up with another model. And I find these principles to be extremely useful in having a joint reflection amongst all the different groups in order to figure out, well, what are we going to do? If we can agree that these principles are important, what's our platform? And then with our platform, where do we go with it? How do we affect local policy? How do we interact with the funders from a position of strength and unity? How do we interact with the business sector from a position of strength and unity? So I'm very excited not just about what a possible national policy impact from these principles, but in terms of helping to organize the food movement on the ground in the hundreds of different food sheds that we have around the country. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Eric, for your presentation. So we have just a few more minutes together, and I want to get to the questions as they're coming up. So feel free to send those questions forward if you have them, or your comments. Really, I'm also very interested in hearing, from people, what do you think about what we were able to accomplish? If you were there, we'd really love to hear your feedback that we could share with other folks. And if you weren't able to attend, and this is your first time hearing about the results of the conference, I'd love to hear your comments and your thoughts as well. So feel free to forward those to us in the question box on your screen. The first question, I suppose, is for either one of the Sam, but Eric, I suppose you could chime in too. It asks the question, how can practitioners deal with secondary trauma as we work in our communities of practice? And that's a really important question. And I want to say one of the things that we built into the conference was that healing dynamic. And so many people commented on the fact that we were encouraging people to take care of themselves as they felt necessary through movement that we incorporated into the schedule, to just having time to sit in a circle and take our time and share. We also included lots of cultural dance. We prayed together to open the space. So I'll let Sam Simmons, why don't you start off if you've got something to share on that particular question, how practitioners can deal with secondary trauma as we work in our communities of practice.
Well, the biggest piece is admitting that it's there. I mean, we get what sometimes I say and I get in trouble with is sometimes passion can kill. Sometimes we're so passionate about issues that we don't stop long enough to deal with what's going on with us, or wait till it's too late. So the thing is as much as being aware of other people's needs, continuously evaluate your own and do an assessment of your own. If not every day, because I try to do that every day with me, because otherwise I'd go a little crazy. Some people say I still am, but at least weekly, you know, because there's nothing wrong with being. How do we? The issue is it's like the airline. They always tell you to put the mask on first before you help somebody else.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Sam. Sam Grant.
Thanks for those comments, Sam. I agree. The thing I'll add to it is that there's a new framework. People call it different things: sustainable activism, embodied activism, transformative movement building, or transformative organizing. It all is saying the same thing, that if you're doing the work of facilitating social justice, you have to take care of yourself. It's not an option, it's an obligation. And too few of us in this work are regularly taking time for our own healing. So on an individual level, we need to take time for our own healing and define those practices of healing that work for us. But then it's also critical to take time, if you want to address secondary trauma, for people to spend time talking with each other about what is coming up. We in our movement circles have to have a supportive environment for each other to keep on healing so we can be fresh and more vibrant and wise as we carry out practice. And that's all I'll say.
Thanks. Eric, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, very little. I agree with both Sam Simons and Sam Grant. I would just say that, you know, sometimes the food movement has acted as if this was sort of extra work. You know, like the real work is the gardens and the policies and the this and the that. And I would just say that, you know, dealing with internalized depression and white privilege is the work. And it's the work for the movement, for the system, it's the work for the movement, it's the work for our organizations, and it's the work for us as individuals and as family. And we've got to build it in, and we have to find the resources to do that. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that we'll somehow take care of this later or on the side or what. I think it is the central part of what we're trying to do. I agree, if we don't transform ourselves, our families, and we'll never be able to talk about transforming our communities and the food system.
Well, thank you. In our final moments of closing, I do want to direct our attention to the principles of food justice located on the IATP website. And I just want to recognize that there were 5 other sessions that occurred during the conference, 5 other PMAs, and they included food sovereignty, which Eric mentioned. There was hunger relief, health disparities in the industrial food system, and there was a PMA on land as well as one on labor and immigration. We also had a PMA on toxins and climate justice in the food system to really build that bridge between food justice and environmental justice. We're going to have sessions on each one of these topics because these are huge, huge themes that run across our work. And it's really important, I think, that we take the time to really dialogue and talk about them in ways that help us better understand each other. It really has always been amazing to me that we can identify very quickly where we don't get along, but it's very hard for us to identify where we do all get along. And so in the final moments of our of our time together, I really wanted to take a chance to get people to think about where have we ever had a fair, just, and healthy food system. And as you can see on your screen, I have a bit of a slide up that I use in my presentation. And basically, this is really to help us reflect on the fact that no matter where we go in our past, we cannot find that fair, just, and healthy food system. And so the work that we're doing really is pioneering work. We're going to have to build this food system as we move forward. We won't be able to roll the time back and find a time where things were perfect in the United States. The only thing that we can do together is make them perfect together. I want to thank everyone for joining our webinar today, and I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. I look forward to talking to each and every one of you about this particular conference. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to email me. You can find my email address at iatp.org. Go to the staff tab there and click on that, and that email will come directly to me. I want to thank my panelists for spending the time with us today, particularly Sam Grant. Thank you for taking time out your travel. I know how difficult it is to move around at the same time and travel and do a presentation, so I especially thank you and honor you for taking the time to be with us. So have a great day, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, everybody.